welcome to alumni, to students, to parents, to family members, to community members. We are so delighted to have all of you here tonight to welcome our special guest speaker, Nancy Kaufman, who is going to share with us around the topic of Jewish values and activism then and now. For those of you who do not know Nancy's story, Nancy has been active in a number of organizations over the years, both as a professional and in a volunteer capacity. Nancy graduated from Brandeis University, or Nancy, should I keep that to myself?
No, it's okay.
I'm proud of. Class of, I'll let you share
1972.
1972. But rather than continuing to have my voice be the one that's centering this conversation, I'd actually like to let Nancy tell you the beginning of her story and start us off with sharing from whence her values and the sort of beginning stages of her work and her activism has come. And then, therefore, without giving any spoilers, we'll get into the depths of her work and her time at Brandeis and everything in between.
Okay, thanks so much, Stephanie, and thank you to all my colleagues at Brandeis. I always welcome the opportunity to come back to school and to speak with all of you. I know people are still joining in the queue, but as Stephanie said, I'm Nancy Kaufman, and I'm a proud graduate of Brandeis in 1972. I guess I would call myself a child of the 60s. Grew up, I think I had activism in my blood from the time I was born. I grew up in Brookline, Massachusetts, and I got a very strong conservative Jewish education at Kehilloth Israel in Brookline on Harvard Street in its heyday, when we would go from there to a devotion school, stop at Irving's candy shop, and then go over to Hebrew school and sometimes get kicked out of class because, you know, we had too much food in our desks. But it was a wonderful place. It was wonderful. And then at those days, as you can imagine, Brookline was a largely Jewish community, mainly Jewish. Now it's much more diverse, which is very exciting to me. I got a basic good Jewish education in Hebrew school and in my community, and then really sort of started acting on my Jewish values and digging further into them when I was in high school, and I was very active in BBYO, the B'nai B'rith Youth Organization, and became a leader in BBYO. Went on my first trip to Israel 3 weeks after the Six-Day War in 1967. At a time when very few people I knew were going to Israel, certainly very few people in my family had ever been. And the way I tell the story is that I'd gotten a scholarship to go. My family could not have afforded to send me. And then the war broke out. And I said, wait a minute. And half the 100 kids were going on a leadership program canceled, and people calling my mother and saying, you're not gonna let her go? And I said, I made a deal, which was one of my first negotiations. I said, if the State Department says it's okay for me to go, I'm gonna go. It was also my first fundraising experience because the trip cost $1,000. BBYO was giving $500 scholarships. I didn't have the other $500. And I asked my mother if she would call her brother, who then had a Brandeis connection. I don't know if he's on or not later in life, but as a philanthropist, board member. She said, no, but you can call him. So I had my first fundraising experience. I called and asked him if he would match that gift of $500. And he said he would, but only if I agreed to speak about my experience when I got back. So those are my early experiences. I actually went off to spend 2 years at NYU, New York University in the Bronx, when there was a campus in the Bronx. But my then boyfriend, who became my husband at Brandeis, convinced me that I should come back to the hallowed halls of Brandeis. So I came back in 1970 in the middle of the student strike that was because of the Kent State, because of Vietnam. So let me hold it there. And if you want me to continue, Stephanie, I can, and tell the rest of the story.
Absolutely. And one thing I'll say before we move forward, just so everyone knows, we will have time for an open Q&A at the end of things. If people have clarifying questions, if we use a term that you're not familiar with, please do let us know that in the chat. But for now, we'll really let Nancy's voice come through first and foremost. Before we go into your Brandeis stories, which I'm sure everyone is now on tenterhooks waiting to hear, I'd love to just ask you, as I might ask of our students, so as a former Brandeis student, here you go. What would you say, looking back on those early years, what were some of the values that were already at play for you in your life?
Well, I was a student of Pirkei Avot, sayings of fathers. I think I must have learned it maybe in 8th grade of Hebrew education, or maybe Hebrew high school, but I really took to Pirkei Avot. It just spoke to me. And so I felt that's where I got a lot of the values that I hold dear to this day. You know, things like, if I'm not for myself, who am I? If I'm only for myself, what am I? If not now, when? I mean, it sort of drove, I said, well, that makes a lot of sense. Or, you know, we're not responsible for completing the work, but we must not desist from beginning it. Those kinds of, do not separate yourself from the community. I mean, these were like short little snippets, right? You didn't have to memorize all of Torah, but they really, really spoke to me. And they spoke to me in a very deep, in a serious way, that I felt it was my responsibility to be partners with God in the repair of the world, that's what I was taught, that's what we're supposed to do. And I took it quite literally, that I was a partner in the repair of the world, and it really drove my entire life since that time. And I've always sought out the opportunity to combine my interest in social justice with a grounding in Jewish values and Jewish and a Jewish understanding. So, you know, those are the kind of driving forces. I could go on and talk about Tzedek Tzedek and Abraham Joshua Heschel, and, you know, et cetera, that many of you know. But it was a real belief that this is a beautiful Torah that we have. The oral Torah, the sayings of our fathers, was really quite, you know, very powerful. And I really, I believed it and still do.
Thank you so much. That's a beautiful answer. So you are in Brookline, armed with some bagels from couples or couples, depending on how people choose to pronounce it. Words of Torah, words of Pirkei Avot, a little detour in New York, and then over to Waltham, over to Brandeis, coming in as these student protests are happening. So tell us about, whether it's the protest experience or other sort of vignettes from your time at Brandeis, how did those values grow or change or increase? And what was the impact of the time on campus?
Well, I started the process when I was at NYU, and I continued it when I got to Brandeis. My boyfriend at the time was an activist at Brandeis. He started his freshman year there and was, you know, one of the people that was very involved in the student strike. In fact, I spent my 18th birthday at NYU taking over a building. But as an 18-year-old is wanted to do, we were taking over a building to protest ROTC on campus. But it was my birthday, and it was my 18th birthday, and I wanted my mail. So I got one of my friends' boyfriends to go get the mail at the mailroom so that I could have my mail while I was sitting in the building that we were taking over. So I was always pragmatic, you know, I always had a practical side. But when I transferred in 1970, it was right after the Kent State killings, murders. Most college campuses had been literally closed down. Finals had been canceled. And I came to live off campus. I got extremely involved right away in the Waltham group that my boyfriend had been a leader of. And I had told him that I'd only come to Brandeis if I had women friends. And I told him he had to introduce me to women because I wasn't coming unless, you know, I was going to have this as wonderful of friends that I had at NYU at Brandeis, all of whom I still have today. And he did introduce me to a group of transfer students who had come after their freshman year. And I interviewed them and I said, okay, they'll be my friends. Some of those people have been my friends for almost 50 years. And Waltham Group really became my way of doing my activism. And I was talking to Stephanie earlier today, who said Waltham Group is still alive and well and active. I tutored in the Chesterbrook Housing Project. I did social action work through Waltham Group. the protests died down a little bit, although we kept marching in Washington. And my first trip to Washington was actually on a march against the Vietnam War. I'd never been to Washington, and we went to protest the war. It was also a very challenging time at Brandeis, and those of you who know the lore probably have heard the stories about the bank robbery and Susan Sachs and Kathy Powers. I have two stories on that. One is that Susan Sachs actually stayed at my apartment, so I was sure the FBI was checking me out. And they got very wrapped up in sort of this, radical, we need to seize our government. And there was a burglary in an armory in Newburyport. In fact, I had my protest principles. I also had my fun principles. Don't think I was only doing protests. So I will remember, it probably doesn't happen anymore, but over at where 128 is, it used to be the hitchhiking site. So if you wanted to hitchhike anywhere, you hitchhike there. And so we were going to the beach in Newburyport, Plum Island, on a beautiful Sunday. And who was hitchhiking but Susan Sachs and Kathy Powers? So we gave a ride to Newburyport. Little did we know we were abetting a crime. But the rest of that is history. You can Google it. It was a very sad, but it was a very, very intense, everyone thought they were going to change the world or we were going to have a revolution. I was more into democracy and doing it within the realm of what was legal. And so it was, as long as we took over buildings and did it appropriately, I was okay with that. But Brandeis was a hotbed of activism. It was amazing. I mean, it was an incredible place to do social justice and to really, as Rabbi Abraham Joshua said when he marched with Martin Luther King, pray with your feet. It was a way to pray with your feet. And so it wasn't until I got married, believe it or not, the week before I graduated. My friends to this day thought I was out of my mind. They didn't know why I was doing that. But I got married at the Student Union at USDAN. Got married in the chapel and then had the reception at the Student Union by Rabbi Al Axelrod, who was the Hillel rabbi at the time. But the combination at Brandeis of commitment to social justice and high quality academics, I actually became an English literature major, which I, to this day, am thrilled that I did because I read things that I probably would never have read since. And for my independent study in Karen Klein's class, who I know isn't there anymore, I did the problem of evil in literature, and we studied Job, and we did, I did work on Job and on the Holocaust, and kind of what does it look like, what does evil look like, and how do we define that? So it was an amazing time, and it was an amazing experience, and I always I've cherished it. And I was in Boston. I stayed in Boston for many years afterwards, till 10 years ago when I came to New York for a job, and always loved it when any of my friends, faculty, colleagues would call me back, and was very proud of my 25th reunion to get the alumni award from the university. So I feel a very close connection to the school.
Such incredible stories, and on the one hand there's the campus professional saying, dear students, please don't get ideas about picking up hitchhikers, but at the same time there were all these little moments in this story in terms of your work as a social activist and involved in social justice, but also it sounds like those things continue to be informed by those Jewish values that you brought with you to campus, and came up in lots of different ways in terms of some of the classes that you were taking, the wedding with Rabbi Al Axelrod, who we love dearly. And I'm wondering, what is sort of your memory of what Hillel and Jewish life looked like on campus at the time?
Well, at that time, and I don't know now, I think you probably have a much more robust, Hillel was very tiny because there were so many of us who were doing our activism through social justice, which was our Torah. And Hillel was this tiny little, it was tiny. And so I'm thrilled at what's happened to the whole Hillel movement nationally since that time, because it didn't have, in my day, the robust, amazing opportunity to do Torah and justice, to be honest. It wasn't until later that I say now retrospectively, I will tell you, and it's all true, but it wasn't until much later when I ended up working in the Jewish community, which was 20 years after I left Brandeis, that I started to put it back together and went back to those roots. It wasn't that I was very actively involved in my synagogue, and my daughter went to a Jewish day school. It wasn't that I wasn't involved. It's just that I had an 8th grade education when it came to Jewish texts. And then I had an activist high school time. And then, like many of us, you know, I'd say really after bat mitzvah, my family couldn't afford to send me to Hebrew college. I would have loved to have gone. But it kind of, you know, you stop learning, which was a terrible thing. Now we have all these unbelievable, you know, online and lifelong learning programs. But it really wasn't like that for a long time. And it wasn't until I came back in 1990 to work with the Federation in Boston as the head of the JCRC for Boston, after having spent 20 years working in anti-poverty work and nonprofit work and government work, all influenced by my Jewish values, no question about it. But I didn't have the language, you know, I didn't have the way to articulate why I was doing what I was doing. And it wasn't until I started really studying, I participated in the MAYA program, I studied text at CJP, you know, with the Scholar in Residence, had their Genesis program at noontime, and I was like a sponge. And I think I was like a sponge because it had opened up to me, and you know, Brandeis was such a gift to me and to the Jewish people. And the fact that there was a Jewish-sponsored university, I always thought was incredible. But I think I took it for granted a little bit too much. And I'd urge everyone who's a student on this call, don't take it for granted. Take advantage of all there is to offer in terms of learning and studying, because I wish I had taken more Nedges courses, which I didn't, because I was too busy, you know, taking sociology, English literature, you know, educational change and social change. And so, you know, but I caught up. You know, I became a very avid adult learner, and always returned to Brandeis every chance I could for every event I could, which was always fantastic and wonderful. And actually had a conference at Brandeis that we involved Brandeis students as well as young leadership from the community in around 1992. It was called Return to Passion, how to turn your passion into action. And it was an attempt to bring together intergenerationally our community with secular organizations in the city for how we could take our Jewish values and really put our own faith into action. And then, you know, I learned in my interfaith work that, you know, so many people in the Christian community really knew their texts. They knew their texts. We couldn't hold a candle to sit around the table. And so an interfaith dialogue became more and more interested in knowing my own story, my own religion, so that I could be at the table with other religions and learn about theirs. So all that was given to me, I think, by my Brandeis education.
It's amazing in its sort of global nature, its holistic nature, all the different things that we get from Brandeis. And I appreciate what you said of take advantage of it while you're there and while you have access to all of these things. Yeah, and certainly Hillel has changed over the years. We're lucky to have a Springboard Social Justice Fellow. We're lucky to have lots of affiliate groups that work on different issues of tzedek and chesed and tikkun olam, of justice and kindness and repairing the world, both within the Jewish community and beyond. And I think part of the strength of that maybe offers the piece that perhaps was missing for you in some ways was that articulation and allowing students to lean into that piece earlier on through Jewish learning and different opportunities like that. And I always find that articulation and ability to sort of discern one's path is kind of crucial as we're figuring out our next steps after college, after grad school, after. So I want to ask you about the after of Brandeis. So you start out with your values and the sort of beginnings of activism in high school. You come onto the Brandeis campus and you're in the thick of it. How do you start to go pro? What did that transition look like?
Well, it was interesting, you know, as every good young Jewish woman at that time, you know, who was told by her parents, you know, you have to be a teacher, I got a teaching, I did student teaching in Newton. And I started, I got a job my first year out of Brandeis as an assistant teacher in Newton, where I had been the student teacher. And my husband then, my boyfriend and husband, who was really a great second and third grade teacher, and he was working in Acton, and I knew I'd never be as good a teacher as he was. I could tell right away. And that wasn't really for me. And yet, you know, I had been programmed that I really needed to do teaching. And I realized after 1 year that wasn't my calling. I wasn't going to be teaching. And I was lucky to get a job my second year out of Brandeis at a adolescent counseling center in Newton, where I was doing all kinds of stuff, working in the community and working with the board, really as an administrative assistant. But as most of my career has been serendipitous, there was a man there who was doing his internship from Boston College School of Social Work in community organizing. And I quizzed him and I said, you can get a degree in community organizing? He says, yeah, they have a master's in social work and community organizing. I went, you really, you know, and really started attaching myself to him, and applied for and got a fellowship my third year out of Brandeis to attend the Graduate School of Social Work at BC in community organizing, a NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health scholarship. And so from there, it was all, that's what I've been doing ever since, is all forms of community organizing. I started organizing then, and my placements, I worked in north of Boston in Malden, Massachusetts, doing organizing. I started and ran at the ripe old age of 28. Don't ask me if I knew what I was doing, but I was the first executive director of a community action agency, an anti-poverty agency north of Boston. And I did that till my daughter was born and Ronald Reagan was elected president. And I just like said, oh my God, I can't both have a baby and deal with Ronald Reagan being president and taking away all the benefits from people. So I took a break, a small break, and then got very involved in the Dukakis campaign for governor in 1981, 82, and went into his administration in 1983 as head of the deputy director of his governor's office of policy, and did that, and then worked in as assistant secretary of health and human services. I then went to the Kennedy School for a year for a mid-career master's in public administration, all, you know, variations on the theme of how do you make change? How do you make change in a community? How do you make change in government? Homelessness was my issue. I worked on it for 8 years, and then ultimately wanted to be closer to the line of where things happen, and became deputy commissioner of the welfare department when I finished. And then when Mike Dukakis wasn't going to Washington, and when he lost the election in 1988, and I wasn't going to Washington, I, you know, could have buried myself in a Republican administration. I wasn't going to do that. And I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I had time. I had like 8 months. You know, I had a lot of time I was still working as deputy commissioner. And I heard about a job opening in the Jewish community as head of the Jewish Community Relations Council. I had no idea what they really did. All I knew was I was a fairly high-level Jewish woman in state government at a time when it was mainly, you know, Irish Americans and Italian Americans. There weren't a lot of Jews either in the legislature or working in government, and became very aware, by the way, of my Jewishness during that time, and got very close to Kitty Dukakis, who I think most people know is Jewish, and we both spent a lot of time talking about where are the Jews? Why, when there's a major social policy issue on the docket of state government that isn't about anti-Semitism or hate crimes, the Jews aren't there. And, you know, we really spent a lot of time thinking about it, talking to people about it, going around to synagogues saying, how come the churches are opening up their basements to the homeless and the hungry, but the synagogues aren't? And, you know, talking to synagogues who thought because they were making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for shelters or something like that, that was social change, and realizing, no, that's not social change. Social change is actually changing the conditions that give rise to the issues that make it possible that people would be on the street homeless and hungry. So I got very deep into kind of what are the causes of everything wrong in our society and everything that's broken. And, you know, felt very strongly and sort of got a real consciousness around if I ever could do anything to fix that, and, you know, try to reconnect our largely suburban Jewish community that had moved out of the city westward, as we tend to do as Jews, to reconnect us to our inner city roots, that would be something I could really throw myself into. And that opportunity came just totally serendipitously. And that's what I would say to students on the line. You never know where or when that opportunity is going to come. No one ever thought they'd hire me for this job, because as at my first interview that I went to, one of them said to me, "But you haven't been to Israel in 24 years. How are you going to do this job?" And I said, "Well, I love Israel and I care about Israel, and I just haven't gone back because no, you know. By the way, I've been 52 times since, so you know, I got there. But you know,
would you like to lead a birthright trip with us when we can do that again?
Oh, I'd love to. I would love to. That would be really fun. I've led a lot of trips for non-Jews to Israel, and that's a lot of what I did in the JCRC. But one of the things that struck me, and I think it's an important realization I had, is that when I was in government, and it happened at the interview, it happened before the interview, I was working on a special message on chronic mental illness for state government. It was a bond authorization, a lot of money for us to develop group homes for the mentally ill and mentally retarded. It was right after deinstitutionalization. And I remember Barry Schrage at the time, who was the head of CJP, and I know is at Brandeis now, who was my friend and colleague, cared deeply about services to the mentally ill and mentally retarded. And he was the one who kind of found me in state government and kept talking to me about, well, the Jews, we care. And I kept saying, really, Barry, really? You just care for the Jews, or you care for everyone that they have, you know, high quality group homes? And I remember him inviting me to come to the board, to speak to the board of the Federation of CJP at the time about the message on chronic mental illness. And I said, great, you know, where's your office? Who are these people? And I walked into the boardroom, I'll never forget it. It was probably in the mid 80s, I guess. And I looked around the room, and I knew a whole lot of the people around that table because they were Democratic activists in Massachusetts. However, they never said they were Jewish Democratic activists. They never took their Jewish values and said to the politicians that they were supporting, it was like two separate worlds. They had their Jewish volunteer work they were doing, and they had their Democratic. And I thought to myself, wow, if we could ever connect those dots, can you imagine how we could influence change and make change? If those people sitting around the table would both be activist Jews and Jewish activists, both Jewish activists and activist Jews, we could actually make change happen in this Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And that's kind of what we started to do. Started to kind of stitch that together so that we created power, and that we decide, you know, we could be a powerful force. And then when you join that, which I spent a lot of years doing with other faith groups, and did the same thing with their clergy and their activists, both grassroots and, you know, grass tops and grassroots, and you then go together to the president of the Senate or the governor or the speaker of the House, and you ask for something for healthcare, for instance. We did affordable healthcare. What they later called Obamacare really started out as Romney Care in Massachusetts under Republican administration. People take notice. When you have a priest and an imam and a minister and a rabbi and a whole bunch of lay leaders and volunteers come together and say, our religious faith values inform what we want to talk to you about. You know what? They listen. And we got past Affordable Healthcare Massachusetts through that kind of coalition, which was very powerful. So it all, you know, it all fits back, you know, it's like a puzzle, and it comes back together. So I thought I would be working in the Jewish community for 4 years and go back to a Democratic administration in Massachusetts, but there wasn't one for 17 years. So I got hooked. I became a Jewish communal professional, and I still am, and I really, it grabbed me, and part of it was the ability to do Torah and justice together.
I love that. And I feel like in some ways that's such a classic story of someone starts working in the Jewish community, because it is something they care about, but perhaps it wasn't the long-term plan. And then lo and behold, they fall in love with the work and what it allows them to do. But it's so fascinating to hear your story, particularly being at Brandeis, being based in Boston. The ways that some of those conversations continue to be alive, whether it's on campus or in the broader community, the language and conversation around social change and social justice work, moving away from models that are sort of performative or band-aids, and really thinking about what are the root causes. Thinking about disability advocacy, that's a huge topic of conversation amongst many Brandeis student leaders now today, including students within the Jewish community and beyond. So it's just interesting to think about the ways that we create these legacies around topics that are important and that we care about through the lens of different values, and the way that we continue to see progress and growth as we move through time, and the work is ongoing.
I mean, I'm happy to, well, go ahead, finish.
No, please.
Okay. No, I'm just happy that I feel proud to have been one of the founders of what I consider the modern day Jewish social justice movement, because at the time that I was involved, Barry was involved, I mean, we really did make this deal that he would be Torah and I would be justice, and that we would go around the community and say, you can't have one with the other. And he would say, you can't have Torah without justice. And I'd say, you can't have justice without Torah. It was very, very important at the time that we did this, because there were on one side of the ledger, the sort of the Jewish education, day school, advocates, synagogue goers. And on the other side of the ledger, there was a whole group of people who were alienated and they were Jewish, but they didn't really feel connected Jewishly. And social justice became their ticket back in. And I think if you talk to rabbis who are around that, and they'll say that it really reinvigorated their synagogues and the work, because what I realized as a community organizer is that the best gateways in the Jewish community, that we have many gateways. We have Hillels, you have synagogues, you have day schools, you have a lot of gateways. And you want to maximize those gateways. So there should be all different gateways that people can enter. But when you enter, you want the message to be Torah and justice, right? You can choose one or the other or both, but they can't be separated. They have to be integrated. And so I brought that to nationally, got together with a few of my colleagues across the country, and we started, after several years of working in fits and starts, the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable. Started with 6 of us, then it was 12, then it was 18. It's now over 60 organizations, some of which didn't exist 25 years ago. And so I feel very proud that, I think Boston really was the beginning of that. And Tzedek Hillel, by the way, which was Brandeis and Tufts were the 2 Tzedek Hillels in the Boston area at the time. This was early on. National Hillel funded Tzedek Hillel coordinators, and we worked very closely with them. So I think we see the sea change. It may be hard for people to imagine that there was a time when it was sort of separate. And what I would hear from people in the inner city was, I'd hear from people when I wanted to start these partnerships with groups in the inner city. I'd go around and speak about this to Jewish communities, and they'd say, oh, but there's anti-Semitism, and what if they don't want us? And I haven't been to Roxbury since my bubby was there, 50 years ago. And I said, well, a few things. One, you partner with people who want to partner with you. You don't have to partner with everyone. And you don't partner with people who don't want to partner. But there's plenty of people who are living in homes in Boston to this day, by the way, with mezuzahs on the doorposts of their house that they don't know what they are. And this is true, because that's where we were. And that their image of the Jewish community was one that abandoned them. That was what they thought. We left, we were asked to take a walk, we took a hike, there was busing, there was all kinds of strife, and there was demographic changes. Some of it was legit, some of it was redlining, some of it was the Jews would be willing to sell their houses to blacks, but Irish and Italian at the time were not. So it was very complicated. There's a book, if people are interested, by Rabbi Hillel Levine and Lawrence Harmon, called The Death of the American Jewish Community. And it's about Boston. And it's very tough. It's very tough on the leadership of the community. But there's some important pieces in there around what happened. I can tell you that figuratively, when I left Brookline in 1968, graduated high school, went off to New York, and I never really came back, but let's say in 1972 when I graduated college and started reconnecting, everyone I had known, I used to say the nice Jewish boys lived in Mattapan and Dorchester, but by 1972 they were all gone. All their families had moved either south or west or north, or so so what do you do when there's not one synagogue left in the city of Boston except Temple Israel on the Riverway? I mean, seriously, or Hillel B'nai Torah, I should say, in West Roxbury, but no one really in the inner city. When you had all these incredible synagogues for years, you're not there. You're not around the table of the PTAs and the healthcare centers and the normal places that people gather. So you're not meeting people of different backgrounds. So you have to create it, and that's sort of what we did at JCRC. We created partnerships with people in the inner city.
Incredible work, and as I was sort of saying before, it's incredible how you know, there is always more work to be done, and we continue to work on the progress of all of the different things. And I wonder, you know, you spoke about hitting the ground running at Brandeis in a time that was particularly challenging, that was particularly fraught. Our students today, all of us, are living in a time that is very complicated for a variety of different reasons, and each person might have an issue that is dear to them that is different from their family or their parents or their, you know, their roommates or whoever it might be. We all have our different values, the things that we care about deeply and that light us up. What advice might you give, whether to students who are figuring this out from a perspective of learning, or those of us in the working world and everyone in between and beyond, as we try to join in these efforts alongside you in doing justice and activism, and really leading with our values in the world?
Well, it's a wonderful question, Stephanie, and I'll answer it by telling a story of something that happened a year and a half ago. As I said, Israel was always very important to me, and obviously Israel became very fraught and continues to be fraught, but it's still, and I've given speeches and happy to do another session on why I'm a pro-Israel feminist, Zionist, who cares about the rights of Palestinians. So that, and I can be all those things. And so I got very challenged. So when I left Boston, I left 10 years ago to become CEO of the National Council of Jewish Women, and in New York, and just stepped down last summer. But one of the things I did was very involved with two things. One is the Women's March, which got very complicated, as you know, a couple of years ago. And the other thing that I'm very proud of is that I did was that we developed a feminist, we worked on developing a strengthening the feminist ecosystem in Israel. So we did a huge conference in Israel in March of 2018, bringing together 200 feminists from all sectors in Israel, everywhere. I mean, Haredi, Ethiopian, disability, you know, advocates, Palestinian, I mean, everybody, literally everybody. And we did a research study on kind of what the status of the women's movement was in Israel, what's happening with the women's agenda in Israel. And then we followed that up with, after this presentation of all the findings, that one of the things that came out is that there really wasn't a network bringing all these activists together. So we decided to develop a cohort of feminist leaders, 17 feminist leaders from literally all walks of life in Israel. And a year and a half ago, we brought them to Washington for our Washington conference, and to have meetings with different people. And one of the case studies, and this is, I'm going to answer your question, one of the case studies I shared with them, which they were extremely interested in. You have to picture sitting around a table, feminists that are, one who is deaf, two Palestinians, two Orthodox women, Russian, Ethiopian, Ashkenazi, Yemenite, I mean, you know, Mizrahi, I mean, you name it. I mean, this is 70 people representing the entire, you know, society of Israel. And one of the case studies I presented to them that I really wanted to was the Women's March. And I did it by having with me the chief operating officer of the Women's March, the chief of communications who happened to be Jewish, myself. And I told the story of what happened around the Linda Sarsour, Tamika Mallory situation. And that, and it's very complicated. I don't want to go into all the details, but it also could be applied to Israel, to Black Lives Matter, to, you know, a lot of different examples. And afterwards, when we did the sort of feedback for the you know, the evaluation, one of the Palestinian women, and then someone else said it, and I've become now this is like their favorite quote. We learned from Nancy that you can't walk away from the table. You need to stay around the table. As hard as that sometimes is, we need to stay around the table. Maybe there'll be times when we need to walk away. I'm not saying you never walk away, but 9 times out of 10, if you stay around the table, you're better off. To wit, I was invited to go to the film festival in Aspen, in what's it called, you know, the famous film festival, when the film, the Women's March film was shown, and it was a film about Tamika Mallory, who was the person who was, you know, seen with the, and I accepted the invitation to be on the panel. And, you know, fortunately my board supported me. Both Linda Sarsour and Tamika were on there. And why did I accept the invitation to be on the panel? I accepted the invitation to be on the panel because in front of the 450 people who were gathered there, I wanted to be able to say what I said a few minutes ago, which is that I am a pro-Israel, feminist, Zionist, progressive who believes in the rights of Palestinians, and that no one can tell me I can't be all those things. You follow my point. And it was we had a panel discussion. It was very interesting. Now, if I had refused to participate, there probably wouldn't have been anyone representing the Jewish point of view, right? So what does that achieve? Then you're in front of an audience of 450 people and no one speaking to the core issues that had been discussed. So I offer that as an answer to your question, a long-winded answer. I'm sorry, Stephanie, but to the question of what I've learned in my career, you know, I know who I am. I know what my principles are. And I would say the same thing with Black Lives Matter when we had that whole thing, also similar. I'd say now, I know there are a lot of people worried about, you know, anti-Semitism in the possibility in Black lives and Palestinian rights and annexation, but I really do believe that we need to be very discerning and very careful about what we say is anti-Semitism and when we say it and what we need to do to educate people. And I could say a lot more about that, but I'll let it come up in questions.
Nancy, I could keep selfishly asking you more questions because I want to know more, whether it's about your time on the National Council for Jewish Women or your political activism. I just want to know more and more and more. But I want to turn it over to our guests to ask some questions, which they can send in via the chat. And then we can start you off with those. So I'll give people just a moment to start with their questions. And one question to start us off, how do you see the current wave of Jewish social justice activism differ from your experience while at Brandeis?
I think it's now normative, and I don't think it was normative when I was at Brandeis. Now it's Jewish social justice activism has become normalized. It's part of the DNA now of the Jewish community, and whether it's being funded, not enough, but it's being funded. There are organizations, you know, Repair the World and Avodah and Join for Justice and you know, incredible numbers of different organizations who are engaged in different ways in Jewish social justice, who have come together, the synagogue movements, you know, you name it, and they, you know, maybe define it or work on it in different ways, but when it all is said and done, I think there's been, and I also think there's a much more serious commitment to Jewish learning and Jewish education around that. So you like I was describing, you have Jewish social justice activists, and this goes back to the civil rights movement. there are a lot of Jews who marched in the Civil Rights days, right? But they weren't really there as Jews, except for the rabbis, to be honest with you. There were many Jews in Freedom Summer. There are many Jews on Freedom Rides, but they weren't necessarily there as Jews. But now we proudly are there as Jews. And I think that's been really, really important to show up as Jewish social justice activists and know both the social justice work and what's Jewish about it. I really think there's been a sea change, and it's very exciting.
It's so true, and I think, you know, not engaging in just idle flattery, but I think you know, you are among the people who we clearly have to thank for some of that normalization of this work on campus. So I say that with true and sincere gratitude. Looking at, we've got wonderful questions coming in. Oh my goodness, and how to choose them. From, and I hope people don't mind me announcing them by name, from Ruth. As an also 70-year-old 1972 Brandeis graduate, I am delighted to hear how you have evolved your career and in life. So there's just accolades coming through. And another attendee asked, could you expand on your thoughts on how to reach out to the community and educate them about anti-Semitism?
Which community? The Jewish community or the non-Jewish community?
You know, it didn't say explicitly, so answer whichever question you like.
Well, you know, the issue of anti-Semitism now is very complex. I'm on the leadership council for something called Integrity First for America, which is the group that's suing the neo-Nazis from Charlottesville, which had its 3rd anniversary yesterday, I believe it was. And I'm doing that because I feel really strongly that we have to hold accountable these people who, in the name of white nationalism, you know, believe the Jews will not replace us, and that is probably the most serious threat we have to us as Jews, and that we have an enormous partnership, or we should have, with the African American community. If you haven't yet, Stephanie, you probably have done a trip to the South. I don't know if you have with your Hillel, but if you haven't, you know, it'd be a great trip once we can travel again. I did one with my synagogue in November to go to the Equal Rights Memorial, Brian Stevenson's museum and memorial, and to go to Montgomery and Selma. And I'll tell you, walking over the Edmund Pettus Bridge was hopefully someday the John Lewis Bridge. But I really did have chills. But when you go to the Equal Justice Memorial and you see basically, those of you who've seen it, they're tombs, they look like tombs, hanging tombs of everyone who'd been lynched over a period of years with the names, if they have the names, and the communities. And then you think about the Holocaust memorials, you know, that we all have, and you realize that, you know, we all have trauma. I mean, every ethnic group has trauma. And I think about, for instance, the African Americans over the years that I took to Israel who would, you know, walk through Yad Vashem and walk through the Children's Memorial and go, I didn't know, Nancy, I just didn't know. Really, you know, so education becomes very important. Both and, you know, we need to educate people about our trauma, but we also need to be educated about, you know, what we did, because it is not over yet, both for Native Americans and for African Americans. It is, you know, I've done a lot of reading, particularly recently, and it's horrible, you know, what we did as a country. So so I think the anti-Semitism, mainly the most heinous anti-Semitism, has been white nationalists. That's not to say that there aren't people who talk poorly of Jews. I like to, and I do believe that, you know, because, you know, we get very hysterical as a Jewish community, and we hate it when anyone says anything bad about us. But there's words and then there's actions. And the actions, the killings, Pittsburgh and Male, you know, people being killed because they're Jews, because they welcome immigrants to this land, is very different than, and I would say, and this will be very controversial, but I'll say it anyway, than a Tamika Mallory, who I met with several times, and I will honestly tell you, I do not think, I'm going to just say this, that she is an anti-Semite. I do believe She knew very little about Judaism. She grew up at the knees of Reverend Sharpton, Al Sharpton, at a time when he didn't know very much about Jews. I still have trouble watching him on TV, but you know, he did do teshuvah. And it was when the father of her child was killed in the street, it was the Nation of Islam who came to her family's assistance, and only the Nation of Islam. And, you know, I'm not excusing it. I can't, you know, Farrakhan is a crazy, you know, ideologue, not as far as I'm concerned. But if you unpack it and you start talking to people as human beings, it is interesting what you find out. Similarly with Linda Sarsour. So these are people I actually got to know. I'm not excusing it, and I'm not saying it's right, but I am saying that I had many experiences early on in the height of Louis Farrakhan, when he was giving speeches at UMass Amherst and he was giving speeches in Boston, where some of my colleagues were chasing after him, having press conferences, putting him on the front page of the newspaper. And I was talking to my black minister friends saying, you know, will you denounce them? Because I think it'd be better if you denounce them than if we as Jews denounce them. And because of the relationships we had developed with those black ministers, they were willing to do that. Because as I said to one of them at one point, no, I said to someone running a community health center, African-American woman, I said, well, what do you think of Louis Farrakhan over a lunch date? And she said, Nancy, I don't think about Louis Farrakhan. I think about hungry children going to bed at night. You know, so it's very complicated, and it's unpacking this, and it's not about sound bites. That's what I would say. It's not about sound bites. It's about really understanding, you know, where these things come from and what's at the root.
It sounds like really at the core of it for you, it's a question of learning and education and humanization of the other, whether that's about the issue of anti-Semitism, but also flowing in other directions as well. I think that's a beautiful answer. I'm going to offer up two questions, just paying attention to the clock, that are sort of along the same lines. So one person asks a current student, do you have recommendations about activism during the pandemic? And another person also asks, for undergraduate students who want to become involved in Jewish activism and community organizing in general, where and with whom do you recommend we get involved? So two questions from current students about what they can do here and now, both specifically in this moment as well as I think in a long-term way.
Well, let me just take the first one first and say, since I'm no longer representing a 501c3, I'm going to tell you exactly what I think. November, the election. Get involved. It will make a difference who is the president of the United States. And I really mean that very deeply. We have an unbelievable ticket with Biden and Harris. And not only do we have, I mean, there is so much work to be done between now and November to write postcards, to make calls. I mean, we're in a pandemic, so you have to do it, but you have to, you know, there's plenty of opportunity. Join Swing Left. Join Move On, I mean, they're just making it easy. You could all be involved from your comfort of your homes, wherever you are sheltering, or when you come back to campus. There is plenty to do. But to me, there is no more important thing right now for our country than for us to have leadership, because the fact that we have 5 million Americans who've had corona is an outrage. And I'll say to anyone who will listen, and the number of people who died is an outrage, and the mishandling of this and the embarrassment for the United States of America. So to me, that is the activism we need to do. And then the second one, tell me again.
The second one was, I think, a sort of longer view of it of as people who are current students are eager to get involved with Jewish activism and community organizing and right. So on. Right. Who would you recommend that they go to? How would you recommend they get involved?
Well, for those of you who are going to be seniors, I'd recommend either doing a year after college with Avodah or Join for Justice and do a fellowship in community organizing with Join for Justice, which is based in Boston, or with Avodah that's based in several places around the country, or Repair the World. All of those would be opportunities to learn community organizing. I would say ask your Hillel staff and to think about what you might do in your own community. I'm sure there's plenty you could do right in Waltham, Massachusetts. And I'm sure there are grassroots organizations doing grassroots work. Certainly doing work when you can go back, lobbying around state issues. And I'm sure your JCRC, my successor, Jeremy Burton, would be glad to be a resource, or Aaron Ogolnik, who's the state government affairs person. The Greater Boston Interfaith Organization is something the Jewish community has been extremely involved in, and I'm sure they would welcome your participation in that. But I think that the important thing is never go it alone. Don't go it alone. To always join in partnership. There's always someone who has been doing the work. I mean, as a Jewish community, we tend to reinvent the wheel a little too much. We tend to think we have the answers. And you know what? There's probably someone else out there doing incredible work that you could partner with. I'm sure the Waltham Group is doing amazing work. So I would suggest that, take a look right around you in your immediate environment and see where you can make a difference. Not to mention right on your own campus. I'm sure there are opportunities for working on racial equity and social justice.
Yeah, if I can just add a plug in there for that question, come and talk to Hillel. We're happy to help you figure that out too, and make those connections and do the work. One final question that maybe we can just give a brief answer to, but I think it's an important one given your work. What are your thoughts about the future of Jewish women's organizations like the NCJW and Hadassah, which have been in decline for a while? Where can younger women go to take action and not feel like they need to first save the organization?
Well, I'd like to think that I helped turn around NCJW from sort of somewhat of a quiet, moribund organization to a really vital one. And actually a former staff member at Hillel is my successor, Sheila Katz, and is doing a great job. So there isn't an NCJW in Boston, but I look up NCJW whenever you get out there in the world, because they're in 60 communities across the country. It's intergenerational. They're doing amazing advocacy, amazing work on getting out the vote. So I think it's alive and well. There's also Jewish Women International that has a fellowship. It used to be the old B'nai B'rith women. I can't really speak to Hadassah. Hadassah is different. Hadassah is mainly a women's Zionist organization that supports a hospital in Israel, and they're a very important organization. But people used to say, what's the difference between Hadassah and NCJW? It's completely different. NCJW is a 125-year-old organization where was the place to go for smart women who didn't work out of the home, but weren't allowed to be, quite frankly, on the boards of their synagogues and of their schools and of their, of anything. And so they came to NCJW because they wanted their brains. And I think it's become one of the best advocacy organizations in the Jewish community. It was very strong. I moved it from New York to Washington, which is why I finally stepped down, was because I really didn't want to move to Washington. And I came to New York from Boston, spending my whole life, so I wasn't going to move to Washington after that. But I felt it was the right thing to do. We consolidated our offices in Washington. But I think it's strong. I think it's effective, and I think it's working on issues of reproductive justice and the courts, two of the biggest issues they work on, and I think doing great work. So there's plenty of places you want to get. Like, the wonderful thing about the Jewish world, folks, is that there are many gateways. Just enter one. Enter one, whether it's Hillel on campus or when you get off campus, it's spin the wheel. It'll be where you feel comfortable, where you like the issues, but there is so many ways to put your Jewish values into action. And it's just such a rewarding, wonderful thing. So I'm really happy I accidentally fell into doing it. And I would urge you all to do it either as volunteers or as professionals, both and, but don't separate yourself from the community. It's an opportunity.
That feels like such a spectacular place.
I can't hear you, Stephanie. Oh, there you go.
How about now? That is such a beautiful and uplifting reminder, and I think maybe we'll close it there. There were some requests from some of the folks in the audience for your contact information, so if possible, we'll send that out after the fact. Before we close, a huge thanks to Institutional Advancement, the Office of Alumni Relations, our Hillel Associate Director of Development, Celine Ginsberg, who joined us this summer. And Nancy, thank you to you for spending this time with us. You began your work in the trenches, and we, the community, are excited to join you there and to continue this work alongside you. So
Thank you, Stephanie.
thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.